What makes a film exploitative? How do you toe the line of discussing real tragedy without using people's suffering for entertainment? Like all topics, this is something I find myself constantly reanalyzing, so I'm open to having my opinion swayed. But I want to delve into why I sometimes don't agree with what people say is exploitative. I'll cover many aspects of exploitation, but let's start with the ethics of showing real footage of suffering in film. A recent example of this is the situation with the Beirut Explosion that heavily inspired a shot shown in the initial trailer for the creator. This explosion killed 218 people, while leaving around 7,000 injured. And while this footage isn't actually shown in the final cut of the film, for argument's sake, I'll treat this scenario as if it were. Corridor Crew touched on this dilemma in episode 111 of their fantastic VFX Artist React series.
And to just even know that under the surface of what are visual effects and really well done visual effects is actual devastation or suffering or death even, it just feels, it's upsetting, yeah. It's not a good idea.
So is it maybe not necessarily the footage itself that's distasteful because it doesn't actually show any real victims, but perhaps it's just the knowledge that real people were being killed here? There are many other uncomfortable realities that we don't want to view and often turn a blind eye to, even though we know that there is suffering behind them. We know that the minerals on our smartphones are sourced by impoverished people in third world countries, and we know that the phones themselves are assembled by children. We know that the food we eat comes from factory farms with horrific living conditions. How fast did you almost click off this video because you're worried I'm about to start lecturing you? My point is that humanity is pretty good at feeling icky about something and then just wanting to put it out of our minds and not have to think about it anymore. So is this dilemma with the Beirut explosion a symptom of this, or is this gut reaction warranted?
I want to go in and have fun. I want to watch things. I want to think things are cool. Yeah. And when it's actual footage from an actual tragedy, it's not cool anymore. I don't enjoy it. Whatever the filmmakers are wanting to do, like, I personally don't like it. Yeah. And it makes me not want to watch the film.
Playing devil's advocate here, how often do people who are offended about showing a real explosion in a movie even think about the tragedy in the first place? What microscopic amount of your week is filled with thinking about the Beirut disaster, much less actually donating money or doing anything at all to help people? So is it possible that people just want to feel like they're doing something? You can show on social media that you're morally appalled and make yourself feel virtuous, but in reality, what good have you actually accomplished? Shouldn't you feel upset with the situation the victims are in, not with the filmmakers for reminding you about it?
You are not giving any of your time, your money, or even your compassion. All you were doing is saying, don't forget about me today.
With the movie having this footage, it's now back into the forefront of our minds, and maybe dwelling on this now will cause people to act on their feelings, and maybe even prevent something like this from happening in the future. We don't want to re-traumatize any survivors, but we also need to be careful not to sweep it under the rug either. Most of us wouldn't even have known that this was a real explosion in the movie until Corridor's video with almost 2 million views showed us. The filmmakers aren't intentionally putting this footage in to draw your attention towards it, but it's just part of a larger narrative in the film. Is Corridor Crew exploiting this tragedy as well by having this footage in their thumbnail? Bright colors with exaggerated reactions that baits you to click on their video and view the comparisons they have highlighted here. I personally don't think that they are, and I think they're extremely well-intentioned, but I'm just identifying an argument that could be made. The film isn't even depicting this tragedy in a mocking way. It's not a joke, like some guy farts and then this explosion is a result of that.
Oh, yes, my dear man. More beans.
It's a devastating tragedy in the film, like it was in real life. What's interesting is that if this same footage was in a documentary, then it would likely be totally fine with people. The intention behind documentaries are often showing truths about specific situations that people might not have been aware of, and focusing on accurately telling their story. So this means that there is a time and place for this type of footage to be shown. I think the intention and tone of the film has to be taken into account. Imagine if the 2012 Avengers movie had footage of the Twin Towers falling during the destruction of New York City, in the midst of them making corny quips to each other. It would feel jarring and extremely out of place. If you're going to show real footage of a tragedy, then advertise your message in that way and take it seriously. Just throwing it in without taking the time to address the full picture would be fairly disrespectful. Also, in this instance, the Twin Towers are definitely more iconic and recognizable than the Beirut Explosion, so of course it would stand out more to people and isn't a perfect parallel. Another interesting thing is that before Corridor Crew knew that what they were seeing was really the Beirut Explosion, they thought it looked awesome.
I mean, it's cool. Is that what we're looking for? Coolness? Because I found it.
Can we pause on it?
You want it to be cool, but then it doesn't really seem that cool anymore.
Wait, what happened?
But that feeling became tainted when they found out it's real. People want to have fun going to see a blockbuster film, not be blindsided by being shown real footage of a tragedy mixed in with the movie. However, I think that does work in favor for the emotional impact of the film. It makes you imagine that this type of explosion or nuclear threat could happen in real life, because it has. And again, no victims are actually shown in the footage. It's just the abstract knowledge that real suffering is happening beneath the surface. I know I may sound somewhat apathetic, but I'm just trying to pinpoint what tangible harm can result from real footage being used. I think an even more thought-provoking dilemma could be that if someone used it in a comedic way, like I alluded to earlier, using it for the purposes of dark comedy. And that's a place where much worse disasters and atrocities are used for jokes. People joke about the Holocaust, slavery, abortion, and for the vast majority, the intention isn't actually to belittle the events, but is turning something tragic into something that we can cope with by laughing. In doing this, comedians can also highlight our hypocrisy for what we do and don't get offended by. So I don't think a joke about the Beirut disaster would, in and of itself, be unethical. Using this tragedy in a way that can have a beneficial outcome if interpreted well doesn't seem wrong to me. I think we need to talk about misfortune and not dismiss the subjects altogether because it makes us feel uncomfortable.
That right this second, right now, somewhere around the world, some guy is getting ready to kill himself. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? Did you ever stop and think about that kind of shit?
This aspect of the topic feels somewhat similar to people that go into an R-rated horror movie and then get mad that it's scary. The creator was marketed as a serious sci-fi drama dealing with the ethics of artificial intelligence and consciousness. Is it so horrible that they get a visceral and genuine response from the audience? In our best stories, we often try to make them relatable to real life. And in doing so, we can create beautiful narratives that have a massive impact on our lives. So, on one hand, we can say, well, it's just a movie, don't take it so seriously, it should just be entertaining. But at the same time, we also love to become emotionally invested in fictional creations, and the passion and emotion we feel because of them are extremely real. So I think of course that filmmakers do have to keep ethical concerns in mind when creating art, but I also think that people should be more open to having their emotions provoked and beliefs challenged, especially when they go to see art that is marketed in such a way. Why should we isolate this instance of suffering beneath the surface when, if we look hard enough, we can find tragedy anywhere? So I personally don't have the gut reaction that this footage is exploitative. But getting into an even more uncomfortable area, what about movies that dramatize serial killers and depict the murder of actual victims on screen? The Jeffrey Dahmer show on Netflix got heavily criticized for merely existing and for depicting Dahmer the way it did. They used actual 911 calls. They made you get emotionally invested in the personal lives of the victims, and they showed various intimate moments and killings from Dahmer's perspective. I've seen some people go so far as to say that 100% of the profits should go to the victims' families. The show's creator, Ryan Murphy, reached out to about 20 families multiple times throughout the writing of the show, and not a single person ever responded. It may sound harsh, but why should they be compensated in any way? They had zero effort in creating it. Creating a TV show costs millions of dollars and has thousands of people behind the scenes that contribute to it. It's their livelihood. So while it's a nice thought, the victims' families aren't entitled to anything. Yes, their loved ones played a part in the inspiration for the show, but that mere fact in and of itself doesn't warrant financial compensation. All forms of artistry are ultimately shaped and inspired by real events that happened around the world and to the artists themselves. These abstract influences are just harder to track, but they're still there. The end product of the show was directly made by the creators, and they have a right to discuss any taboo topic they want, as do we all. Of course, just because we can doesn't mean that we should, but in this instance, I think they did an excellent job of being as respectful and conscious of the victims as possible while still telling an emotional and interesting story. Evan Peters spoke about his decision to take on this role in this Actors Roundtable discussion.
The amount of times that the police department and the justice system failed to stop him because of racism, homophobia, prejudice, it was just, it was too much. It was way too much. And so I was really compelled to try to push myself.
I assume most people would find that these elements of the story are things that need to be told. We can read about the cold facts of racism or discrimination in a book, or we can dramatize the truth on screen so that it's more widely understood, and we can feel empathy when we witness what that might have actually looked like. Watching this show should feel uncomfortable at times, but not everybody likes dwelling in that feeling. So, particularly to the victims' families, it's perfectly fine that they don't want to watch or be reminded of the murders. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the world can't learn about them. These are sad truths that happened, and for a better understanding of what it means to be human, I think we should be allowed to discuss them. This issue of exploitation seems much more prevalent in the true crime genre than it is in something like war movies. Films about war show real suffering on a far greater scale than serial killers, and yet I rarely see people upset with depictions of people dying in World War II movies. Or how about in Oppenheimer? Is it exploitative that they showed hardships and mental torment that he went through and embarrassing intimate moments in his life? I've mostly just seen people praising Cillian's performance and fascinated with the history. And yet, at the same time, there are those that would be opposed to them depicting the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in that film. How is showing one type of trauma more exploitative than the other? The film still uses the victims of the bombings as character development for Oppenheimer's psyche, so they're still being used as a plot device. I don't think that the mere presence of something sensitive means that you're exploiting it in a negative way. I think there are tasteful ways to depict all tragedies. When done with respect for those harmed, they can really enact a unified compassion in us. Yes, I see the irony here, that in Schindler's List, they had the real victims' approval and brought them on set, while in the Dahmer series, the victim's lack of reply could be seen as disapproval of the show. But again, I don't think they have to go through the process of being reminded of the tragedy for the material to still be respectful to them. And you could argue that it's actually more important to make shows like Dahmer rather than countless war dramas because of the fact that the smaller quantities of victims that serial killers leave behind are more unknown compared to world wars that affected everybody. The Dahmer series showed the pain of those in the vicinity of a serial killer in a way that, to my knowledge, hadn't been previously done. There's a lot of screen time to specifically his neighbor and how many times she complained to the apartment or police and was ignored. The show also dedicates time to becoming emotionally connected to his various victims. This highlights the damage and destruction that Dahmer's actions caused, and they can help convey a message of empathy to people. Yes, it's very uncomfortable to witness, but it's the truth. My favorite example of victims' voices being heard actually comes from nonverbal interactions in the film No Man of God. Throughout the duration of the movie, there are several instances of the camera lingering on women that technically aren't murder victims themselves, but they very well could have been. And the FBI agent who was interviewing Bundy is starting to see women in the same disturbing way that he does. These mere seconds hold so much tension and trauma and are some of the most thought-provoking elements in the film. These moments culminate in a powerful scene where Bundy is giving his famous last interview. The camera slowly zooms in on this young female assistant as she has to stand there and listen to Bundy calmly explain why he is the way he is. While holding back tears of presumably rage and fear, the interview fades into the background as she horrifically tries to wrap her mind around the situation. The last topic from Dahmer I feel needs to be addressed is people's concern about idolization. Thirst traps showing how sexy Dahmer was popped up after the series aired. What percentage of them are attempts at dark humor versus those that are genuine is hard to discern, but I lean towards the majority of them being the former. Dark humor has always been a way of coping with disturbing realities. However, it's also known that groupies that fall in love with serial killers and actually marry them have always existed. Some women will send in sexy photos of themselves to serial killers, even though there's a high likelihood that they won't even get a response. Are they getting off on the idea of sexually pleasing these killers? Are they just seeking attention and wanting to establish a connection with someone infamous?
The wall of your cell must be quite a sight to see.
Oh, I don't keep them. No, I trade them to other inmates for favors, commissary, and the like.
You don't like them?
I always know there will be more in the next day's mail.
So we of course shouldn't idolize serial killers, but portraying them in a realistic manner doesn't do that. It does the opposite because it shows they are human. If we treat them as topics we can't discuss because they are too monstrous, then you mythologize and elevate them to a supernatural level of evil. And I think that paints them in an unrealistic way that does harm. Unfortunately, some people are always going to find danger sexually appealing, but treating them as human will allow us to understand their behavior and hopefully prevent it in the future.
Well, he isn't some kind of monster, because he wasn't at the beginning. He's sick, demented, sure, but when you start using jargon like that, those impassioned terms, you forget that there's a lot of him that's in you.
I don't know about that.
There's nothing that this guy has thought that you haven't thought at one time or another.
A lot of this movie's dialogue is based on real interview transcripts, so assuming that this is something the real Ted Bundy felt, does the fact that he's the one saying it make his points any less valid? It might feel unnerving to admit the similarities we have with people who commit gruesome acts of violence, but it's also ignorant to not acknowledge the vast similarities that we share. Serial killers and your average Joe are both the same species. People criticize the casting of Evan Peters because he's too attractive, and they thought that made Dahmer too endearing or sympathetic. The actor outside of the role is an attractive and put-together person, but in the show, he isn't dolled up to look sexy to the audience. He looks authentic to the real person. He has a constant, unkept look of ungroomed facial hair and a slimy grime of sweat on him. It's well known that Dahmer got into exercising and lifting weights, so the actor playing him has to be in good shape as well. If the actor of Ed Kemper and Mindhunter was randomly a super chiseled model, then that makes sense for this complaint. But if we just view the actor as the character that they're portraying, then this issue seems like a moot point. So in order to understand how someone like Dahmer was able to pick up guys and manipulate people, then we have to recognize that serial killers are human like the rest of us. And humanization will, in turn, make aspects of them relatable. Showing intimate or humanizing moments from Dahmer's life isn't about romanticizing the person, but highlighting how dangerously wrong a human life can end up. If you're upset with being reminded that serial killers can blend in with your friends and family members, then be mad at that fact of life, not with the filmmakers telling the truth. This ultimately leads to the next dilemma of asking how much of the gruesome reality needs to be shown in a movie in order to be accurate, respectful, and leave a meaningful impact on the audience. A lot of people say that depicting graphic violence on screen is lazy shock value and needlessly gratuitous, and in cases where the victims are based on real people, that it's tasteless and exploitative. The definition of exploitation is the action or fact of treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work. This is a very broad definition, so I think people instead use their gut reaction when seeing dramatized real tragedies. And this feeling guides them on if it's truly exploitative or not, regardless of if the material is depicting them fairly. Take the movie Titanic, for example. I've never seen people criticize this movie for being exploitative, and yet the suffering of those who died on the ship are shown in full and turned into one of the highest grossing films of all time. Also, take the fact that the two main characters were only loosely inspired by real people, and a large amount of their relationship was created just for the movie, so it's not like they're revealing the truths of specific victims. I personally don't have a problem with this, because by getting you emotionally invested in the story, it causes you to spend time actually thinking about the tragedy. If the movie didn't exist, then the only way you would know about the Titanic is by word of mouth, or by merely reading the headline of some old news article and then moving on with your day. So I think there's a linguistic definition that has to be made between good versus bad exploitation, because exploitation in and of itself isn't always negative. An example of bad exploitation might be found in shows like Beyond Scared Straight, where the producers are financially benefiting off of causing young kids mental trauma. We can hope that at the very least, their intentions are good and really wanting to prevent children from growing up to become criminals. But the way this show is filmed doesn't really seem that way. This excellent video by Patrick CC goes into detail about whether or not this program actually works. Or take this scene from Nightcrawler where he films all the dead bodies in the murder house. His intention isn't to go inside and see if he can help anybody, but he just wants to capture the most gruesome and bloody footage that he can so that he can sell it to the news station. What responsibility does the media have when conveying this information to the public? They blur the faces of the victims, but also build up suspense to their audience so they can keep them scared and invested in their news outlet. With the victims obviously being dead, then the only real harm you can cause by showing them is to their loved ones. We should be sensitive to their happenstance and not want to re-traumatize them. However, if showing the reality of an event can raise awareness or cause an emotional concern in people, then I think that's a good thing. Just because it's an uncomfortable situation to discuss doesn't mean we should never speak of the tragedy again, because then it's more likely to happen to someone else. We shouldn't allow short-term concerns to cause long-term consequences. People do have a right to know about crime that is happening near them and that could impact their safety. However, do we really need to see all the gory details? I think sometimes you do, and a response to this could be, why do you need graphic violence in order to ethically care about something? Morally, I don't, but emotionally, yes, I do. There's a huge disconnect of empathy that happens when we have to imagine suffering in the abstract without actually witnessing it. There are various thought problems that point out this detachment, such as saying that there's nothing immoral about buying $200 shoes, but refusing to step into a pond to save a drowning child and soil them would be. Seeing the drowning child in our immediate proximity sparks the action in us to save them. But if someone said that instead of buying those $200 shoes in the first place, you could donate that money to save sick children overseas, you likely wouldn't. This disconnect emphasizes how seeing suffering up close evokes our emotion and likelihood of helping more than statistical data does. We can intellectually debate about our ethics, but our emotions are more likely to cause real action. As I explained in my Oppenheimer video, I don't think that an overabundance of empathy always has positive outcomes, due to it being so short-sighted. But emotion does need to be a factor in living altruistically. So in the case of filmmaking, where the creators are sometimes trying to spark an emotional reaction from the audience, they often have to show the graphic reality in order for it to be as emotionally effective as possible. A film that censors the violence and that I think ultimately results in a lessened emotional impact is the movie Nitram. This is based on a true story and shows the mental decline of a young man who ends up inheriting a small fortune. This financial freedom allows him to indulge in his darkest thoughts and easily collects a stash of firearms. He then commits a mass shooting that kills 35 people in Tasmania, Australia. However, in the film, all the murders happen off-screen, and then the film ends by relaying over text how many died and the effect that it had on initiating Australia's gun buyback program. By not showing any of the violence, it diminishes the chilling message they are trying to convey. If you want to make a big dramatic statement at the end about gun ownership, then in order to leave a meaningful emotional impact, you have to show the brutal negative outcomes we're trying to avoid. Mass shootings are horrifying, so depictions of it should be as well. I know we don't want to glamorize the violence, but I don't think showing it in the right context does that. We have to be careful that in the process of trying to respect the victims, that we don't forget or ignore what they really went through. The filmmakers even go so far as to not mention the name of the killer throughout the movie. The name Nitram is an anagram of the real shooter, Martin Bryant, and they fabricated the name Nitram as a childhood insult in order to not further glorify him. However, they are still making an entire film involving intimate details from his life that can cause you to understand and sympathize with his predicament. And if you're curious like I was to see how much of the film is true, you'll find out the real shooter's name anyways, so this seems like a pointless change. I don't think that empathy or understanding for people that have done evil things is in any way exploitative or a bad thing. The emotional impact you can get from movies can be life-changing. They can cause you to think about taboo topics that you otherwise never would have. And they can challenge your beliefs in what you've always known to be true. They can spread awareness of unknown tragedies and elevate unheard voices. So I want films that carry a heavy emotional and psychological burden, because those are the ones that can cause real change. It's okay, and in fact healthy, to feel disturbed when watching real or recreated depictions of a tragedy. I think we just need to be mindful about how we interpret those emotions. Why be offended of depictions of a tragedy when, instead, we could be unified in trying to understand and prevent them? Thanks for watching until the end. If you want to support the channel even further, consider joining my Patreon. You can participate in monthly Q&As and get insight into what I'm working on next. And a huge thanks to those of you who are already over there. Thanks for watching my videos.